If I handed you some money and told you to move to Kentucky next week, there's a good chance you would accidentally end up in one of the hardest places in the state to live. Not because you're reckless, but because many towns in Kentucky do not look bad at first glance. And that is exactly what today's video is about. Top 10 worst towns to live in Kentucky. Kentucky sells people a dream that is very easy to believe. Beautiful mountains, tight-knit communities, housing that still seems within reach, a slower pace of life, and the feeling that life here is somehow more real than in a lot of other places. On paper, it sounds almost too reasonable, but when you look closer, past the home listings, past the quiet charm of small-town streets, past that feeling of this place seems livable, you start to see towns where basic infrastructure has become a burden. Communities still living in the aftershock of an old disaster, places where the jobs are real but the air comes with its own bill, and towns that look so normal that normal itself becomes the trap. This is not vague intuition. These are the warning signs that most people only recognize after they are already living there. Number 10. Newport. There is a certain kind of town that does not wave a red flag at you, it waves a brochure. Newport is that kind of place. From the outside, it looks like a smart move. It sits right on the river, close enough to Cincinnati that the skyline almost feels like part of the furniture. There is Newport on the levee, the riverfront, the South Bank shuttle, and that whole I can be near the city without paying full city pain promise that sounds very good in your head when you are apartment hunting. The shuttle literally runs between Newport, Covington, and Cincinnati, which makes the whole place feel plugged in before you even unpack a box. And that is exactly where Newport gets slippery. Because this is not a warning about a town that looks broken. This is a warning about a town that looks convenient enough to make you lower your guard. The numbers are the first clue. Zillow puts the typical Newport home value at about $240,000 as of January 31st, 2026. The city's median household income is around $60,000, but the poverty rate still sits at about 20.8%, with the population hovering around 14,000. That is not a ghost town. That is not a boom town either. That is the kind of place that can look stable from the car window and still feel tighter once you actually live inside it. And here is the part people tend to miss. Newport is not really priced like the Kentucky people imagine in their heads. Kentucky's median gross rent is still under $1,000, while Newport listings regularly sit well above that line. So now you are already paying for location, for access, for the feeling that you are one bridge away from a better map pin. Usually when people pay more, they expect the extra cost to buy them a little peace. Not luxury, just peace. But crime is where Newport stops feeling like a clean bargain. Recent compiled datasets show overall crime running well above the national average, with property crime doing a lot of the heavy lifting. That does not mean every block is chaos. It means this is not the kind of place where a higher rent automatically buys a lighter mind. That is the trade-off here. You move in because the river looks nice, the commute makes sense, and the city feels close enough to borrow without fully marrying it. Then a few months go by, the rent stops feeling reasonable for the location. You start locking the car with a little more intention. You pay for the convenience, but you still budget mentally for caution. Newport does have real strengths. That location is real. The access is real. The energy is real. This is not some dead town waiting for a miracle. That is why it is so easy to misread. People rarely get fooled by places that already look like trouble. They get fooled by places that look polished enough to hide the trade-off. Newport is like an apartment with a beautiful skyline view and a lease full of fine print. Close to the city, not automatically close to peace of mind. Number 9. Cumberland. Some towns don't fool you with glamour, they fool you with comfort. Cumberland is one of those places. At first glance, it can feel almost reassuring. Tucked deep in the mountains of Harlan County with a small population of a little over 2,200 surrounded by scenery that still knows how to stop you for a second, Cumberland has the kind of quiet that makes people think, Maybe this is what simpler living is supposed to feel like. The homes are cheap enough to make city buyers blink. Zillow's latest figures put typical home values around just $50,000. That is not low by big city standards. That is low enough to make people start telling themselves a story. Maybe I could live slower here, maybe I could own something here. Maybe this is the deal everybody else missed. And that is the trap. Because Cumberland is not really warning you with chaos, it is warning you with limits. The city's median household income sits around $35,300, and more than half of residents live below the poverty line in the latest Data USA profile. Harlan County, the larger system around Cumberland, remains classified as distressed by the Appalachian Regional Commission for fiscal year 2025, and county poverty is still near 29%. This is not just about one struggling block or one rough year, it is about living inside a region that has been trying to replace lost momentum for a long time. That is what makes Cumberland different from places that feel obviously broken. This town still has beauty. It still has identity. It still has people who know each other, help each other, and hold on hard. Kingdom Come State Park is right there above it all, almost like the landscape is trying to remind you that not everything here is decline. And that part is real. The mountains are real. The attachment is real, but attachment is not the same thing as opportunity. That is the warning people need to hear. A place can feel grounded and still leave you with fewer exits than you thought. Coal may still matter in Harlan County culturally and economically, but the broader trend is hard to ignore. Kentucky coal employment recently fell to around 3,600 workers statewide, the lowest on record, and long-range projections tied to local migration and aging patterns point to severe population decline in Harlan County over the next couple of decades. That means the risk in Cumberland is not some loud daily disaster, it is the slow pressure of living in a place where the future keeps getting narrower. So picture it. You buy the cheap house, you fall in love with the mountain views, you tell yourself the trade-off is worth it because life feels calmer here. Then months go by and the quiet starts changing shape. It is no longer peaceful quiet, it is limited quiet. Fewer jobs, fewer options, fewer reasons for the next generation to stay. Cumberland is like a beautiful porch with not much road behind it. Number 8. Martin. If the biggest question in your town is whether the basics even feel reliable, that is not small-town charm. That is a warning. That is Martin. This place does not scare people with one dramatic headline. It drains them through the everyday stuff. Martin County still has cheap housing by almost any standard, with median home values under $90,000 and median gross rent around $450. But that bargain starts to look very different when water pressure problems, water quality concerns, and rising utility costs have been hanging over daily life for years. For a lot of outsiders, Martin can still sound manageable. The mountains are beautiful, the pace is slower, the price tag looks merciful. But this town is a reminder that low housing costs do not mean much when one of the most basic parts of life starts feeling unstable. But Martin is a reminder that cheap housing means very little when basic stability starts to feel expensive. Because the real problem here is not some loud cinematic crisis. It is something more draining than that. It is the feeling that one of the most basic parts of life, water, has been a source of pressure for years. The EPA's own affordability case study says residents in Martin County have struggled for decades with water pressure problems, water quality concerns, and rising bills. One study it cited found water service had become unaffordable for more than 45% of county residents after rates jumped more than 40% in just 1 year. That is not abstract policy talk. That is stress coming through the faucet. And the bigger backdrop does not help. Martin County is still classified as distressed by the Appalachian Regional Commission. The county's population has dropped sharply over the last decade, down roughly 14.5% from 2014 to 2024. Median household income sits around $37,000, while poverty is close to 34%. So even when something looks low cost here, it lands on households that already do not have much room to absorb another hit. That is what makes Martin so easy to misunderstand. It does not scream, it drains. In July 2025, state lawmakers were told the county water system was still losing around 45% of its water, far above the statewide average. Officials also said the system was operating in the red, pushed down by leaks, storm damage, temporary pumps, and diesel costs. Then add another layer. In early 2025, FEMA opened a disaster recovery center in Martin County after severe storms, flooding, landslides, and mudslides. So picture this: you buy the inexpensive house. You like the mountain quiet. You tell yourself you can handle the trade-off. Then the months roll by and the trade-off stops feeling small. It is the bill, the uncertainty, the sense that everyday life depends on systems that never quite feel settled. Martin is like a house with a low price tag and a foundation that keeps sending reminders. Number 7. Harlan. Some towns make you feel like the story is still alive, even when the future is quietly leaving the room. That is Harlan. This is not the kind of place that hits you with chaos on day one. Harlan does not really warn you with noise. It warns you with a slower question. What happens when a town still has pride, history, and heart, but fewer and fewer ways forward? Because on the surface, Harlan can be easy to fall for. The mountains are real. The sense of place is real. The local identity feels stronger here than in a lot of towns that are technically doing better. It has that old coal country weight to it, the kind that makes a place feel rooted. Like it has been through enough to survive anything, and that is exactly where people can misread it. Harlan County is still classified as distressed, and the population has already fallen from about 26,800 in 2020 to roughly 25,000 in 2024. That alone tells you this is not some quiet comeback story. It is a place still losing ground, and the longer-range picture is even harder to ignore. Projections tied to Kentucky State Data Center analysis suggest Harlan County could lose nearly half its population by 2050. That is not a rough patch. That is a shrinking horizon. The numbers underneath it feel very coal country too. Median household income is a little over $41,000. Poverty is close to 30%. Home values are still relatively low, around the low to mid $90,000 range, which can make the place sound affordable if you're only looking at listings. But cheap entry does not mean strong opportunity. That is the lesson here. Coal still matters to Harlan culturally, and it still matters to some local livelihoods. You can feel that, you can hear that, but the long-term trend is hard to dodge. Coal employment across Kentucky has dropped hard over the years, and by early 2026, statewide coal jobs were down to around 3,600, the lowest on record. So even if the identity is still standing, the economic engine behind that identity is not what it used to be. And that is what makes Harlan such a powerful warning. This is not a town with no soul. It may have too much soul for its own good. It is like an old family house filled with memories, framed photos, and reasons to stay, until one day you realize there are not many doors left that open into the future. Harlan is not here because it has no value. It is here because value, pride, and belonging do not automatically create momentum. Number 6. Cynthiana. Some towns don't look fragile at all. They look settled, they look familiar. They look like the kind of place where if life goes sideways, there is still one solid thing you can count on. For Cynthiana, that thing is the hospital. And that is exactly why this town belongs on the list. Because the warning here is not crime. It is not chaos. It is not some dramatic collapse you can see from the highway. The warning is much quieter than that. It is what happens when a small town leans too hard on one pillar, and that pillar starts doing survival math. Harrison Memorial Hospital is not some tiny side clinic. It is a 61-bed community hospital and one of the biggest employers in Harrison County, with more than 500 workers. In a town of roughly 6,400 people, that is not just a hospital. That is a source of jobs, routine, trust, and the basic feeling that if something goes wrong, you are not completely on your own. That is what makes this kind of town easy to misread. To an outsider, Cynthiana can sound manageable. Small town pace, not too expensive. Local community, a hospital right there. For a lot of people, that last part almost acts like a mental shortcut. They hear local hospital and automatically translate it into stable place to live. But that is where the trade-off starts to show. In 2025, Harrison Memorial was already preparing to cut around $2 million in yearly costs because of pressure tied to looming Medicaid changes. That matters because when a rural hospital starts asking which services can still survive financially, the issue is no longer just healthcare policy. It becomes a town-level warning. And Cynthiana does not have a huge cushion if that warning gets louder. Median household income is around $54,600, but poverty is still over 30%. That means this is not the kind of place where families have endless room to absorb longer drives, fewer local services, or more instability in one of the town's biggest anchors. That is the deeper problem here. The fear is not that the hospital disappears tomorrow. The fear is that a place built around one major source of reassurance starts living with the question, what if that reassurance gets thinner every year? Cynthiana is not hopeless. That hospital still matters. It still works. It still holds real value for the community. But that is exactly why this warning hits harder. Cynthiana is like a table that stands strong because all the weight rests on one thick leg. It looks steady until that leg starts to shake. Number 5. Louisville. Some cities don't scare people away, they convince people they can handle them. That is Louisville. At first, it can feel like the manageable version of city life. Bigger opportunities, bigger energy, more neighborhoods, more food, more culture, more movement. If someone wants Kentucky but still wants a real city, Louisville is usually the name that rises to the top. And honestly, that part makes sense. This place has real momentum. It has hospitals, jobs, logistics, sports, universities, and enough urban life to make people feel like they are choosing growth instead of getting stuck. That is exactly why it can be easy to underestimate. Because Louisville is not a warning about collapse. It is a warning about tension that does not fully leave even when the numbers start improving. And to be fair, some of the numbers really are improving. Homicides have come down, non-fatal shootings are down, robberies are down, carjackings are down. That matters. It would be lazy to pretend the city is not making progress, but progress and peace of mind are not the same thing. Louisville still ranked 15th nationally in homicide rate in one 2025 analysis using FBI data. So even while the city moves in the right direction, the old reputation has not exactly packed up and moved out. That creates a very specific kind of pressure for anyone thinking about living here, because Louisville is no longer cheap enough to brush that pressure aside. Typical home values are now around $254,000. Median gross rent sits above the statewide norm. So this is not some bargain bin city where you shrug and say, well, that is the trade-off. No, Louisville asks you to pay more for city life while still making you do city math in your head. That is the part people do not always see coming. You move here because it feels like the smart compromise. Not New York expensive, not Chicago cold, not tiny town limited. It sounds like the place where you can still build a life without getting crushed. Then a little time passes, and you realize the calculation never fully goes away. Which neighborhood? Which street? How late? How often? How much caution is normal and how much is too much? And that is what makes Louisville such a strong entry on this list. It is not frozen. It is not hopeless. It is not standing still. It is getting better. But it is also the kind of city where getting better does not immediately mean feeling easy. Louisville is like a car moving in the right direction after a rough stretch of road, but you still have not loosened your grip on the wheel. Number 4, hazard. Some towns do not feel broken. They feel tired in a way that is harder to explain. That is hazard. If you just pass through, you might not understand why this place belongs this high on the list. The mountains are still there, the town still moves, people still go to work, open shops, wave at each other, and try to keep life looking normal. On the surface, Hazard can still feel like one of those Appalachian towns that has taken some hits but never lost its soul. And that is exactly why it is easy to misread, because the warning here is not just poverty, it is not just jobs, and it is definitely not some lazy drug town label. Hazard is what happens when a community has to spend too many years living in recovery mode. After a while, the problem is not only what was lost, it is how long people have had to carry it. Perry County is still classified as distressed, which already tells you this is one of the economically weakest kinds of counties in the country. Then you add the opioid layer, and the picture gets much heavier. Perry County ranked 4th in the nation in one AMFA vulnerability map tied to the opioid crisis. That does not just mean overdose headlines. It means the county sits in a place where addiction has had the power to reach into families, work, health, and the basic emotional stamina of the whole community. That is the part people miss. Hazard does not always hit you with one dramatic image. It shows up in the after effects, in the way a town can still function while carrying too much grief for too long. Median household income in Perry County is only around $42,000. Poverty is roughly 1 in 4 residents. That means there was never a huge cushion here to absorb wave after wave of damage in the first place. And to be fair, this town is not standing still. There are real efforts to renew downtown, rebuild civic pride, and write a new story beyond coal decline and opioid loss. That matters. It would be unfair not to say that. But recovery is not the same thing as being finished with the damage. That is the real warning of Hazard. A place can still have heart. It can still have beauty. It can still be fighting hard to come back. But if a town is spent too long surviving, survival itself can become the full-time job. Hazard feels like someone who left the emergency room a long time ago, can walk, can smile, can even joke, but whose body never really forgot the impact. Number 3. Calvert City. Some towns don't scare you with what you can see, they make you wonder about what you can't. That is Calvert City. At first glance, this place can look like a pretty reasonable deal. It is small, industrial, and practical. Not flashy, not collapsing, not one of those towns that instantly makes you think something has gone wrong. In fact, Calvert City can almost feel reassuring. Big chemical and materials employers are still here. The town has jobs. Housing is not outrageously expensive. The typical home value is still under about $172,000. And average rent sits around the kind of number that makes people think, okay, maybe this is one of those places where you can still build something without getting buried. And that is exactly where the warning begins. Because Calvert City is not a story about no opportunity. It is a story about the kind of opportunity that may come with terms and conditions written into the air. The EPA's 2024 Air Risk Assessment did not dance around that. It found elevated VOC levels in the Calvert City area, enough to raise chronic cancer risk estimates with long-term exposure. And the biggest red flag in that assessment was ethylene dichloride, or EDC, which EPA identified as the main contributor to chronic cancer risk at all 3 monitoring locations. The agency also said the largest source of EDC emissions was Westlake vinyls. That is not rumor, that is not somebody being dramatic, that is a federal risk assessment spelling out that the long-term question here is not just what the factories pay, but what they leave behind. That is what makes Calvert City such an easy place to misread. You can picture somebody taking the job because the paycheck is solid, the town is smaller than a metro, and the math looks clean enough to call it responsible. Population is only around 2,500. Median household income is around $42,500. It is not some booming suburb, but it can absolutely sound manageable. Then the deeper trade-off starts to settle in. This is the kind of place where the factory can support your mortgage and still leave you asking a different kind of question later. Not, can I afford to live here? But what exactly am I trading for that stability? Because some towns do not hide their cost in rent. They hide it in exposure, in time, and in how long you plan to stay. That industrial base is real. The jobs are real. The town's economic logic is real. That is why this warning matters. People rarely get fooled by places that already look hopeless. They get fooled by places where the deal looks clean until they remember that air can carry fine print too. Calvert City is like a steady job with good benefits right up until you read the small print at the bottom of the contract. Number 2. Winchester. Some towns do not scare you away. They make you comfortable enough to stop asking questions. That is Winchester. At first glance, this place can feel like a smart, manageable choice. It sits in Clark County, close enough to Lexington to feel connected, but far enough away to seem calmer, cheaper, and easier to breathe in. It is not some isolated mountain town. It is not some giant city either. It lives in that middle zone people love to trust. Big enough to feel functional. Small enough to feel under control. And that is exactly why it is dangerous to read too quickly. Because Winchester does not really throw off huge warning signals. It is not the kind of place that introduces itself with chaos. It introduces itself with normalcy. Population around 19,000. Median household income in the mid $50,000 range. Median home value around $188,000. Median rent still under $1,000. On paper, it looks like one of those towns where you can still put together a reasonable life without feeling crushed. But the warning here is simple. Do not confuse a normal-looking town with a truly stable one. That is where Winchester gets complicated. The stress here is not loud, it is under the surface. In 2025, local reporting showed a months-long investigation in Clark County that led to 17 arrests, many tied to drugs. That matters, not because one investigation defines a whole place, but because it tells you something deeper. This is not just a random headline passing through town. It is the kind of pressure that builds quietly enough to require long investigations, repeated intervention, and a community that keeps trying to hold itself steady while something underneath keeps pulling. That is the real story. Winchester can still look fine from the outside. That is why people misread it. You can imagine someone moving here because the house seems affordable. The drive to Lexington feels doable and the whole place looks balanced. Not too rough, not too remote, not too expensive. Then time passes, and you start realizing that the town does not feel unstable in an obvious way. It feels strained in a quieter one, like people are still getting through life, but with more drag underneath than the surface lets on. Winchester is not hopeless. Its location helps. Its size helps. Its cost is still more manageable than bigger metros. Those things are real, but sometimes the easiest towns to underestimate are not the ones that look rough. They are the ones that look calm enough to make you lower your guard. Winchester is like a lake that looks smooth early in the morning, right until you realize the current underneath is doing most of the work. Number 1. Mayfield. Some towns do not stay broken in obvious ways. They rebuild just enough to make outsiders think the worst is over. That is Mayfield. This is not number 1 because the town looks destroyed today. That would almost be easier to understand. Mayfield lands here because the storm is old news to everyone who does not live there, but for a lot of people inside the town, the aftershock never really left. That is the warning. People hear tornado in 2021 and naturally file it away as something finished. Past tense. Tragic, yes, but over. But Mayfield is the kind of place that reminds you surviving a disaster and recovering from it are not even close to the same thing. The tornado took homes in one night. What it took after that was something slower and harder to replace. Stability. That is where this gets heavy. Even years later, families were still dealing with temporary housing, staying with relatives, rotating through transitional setups, or waiting for the kind of normal life that never seems to come back on schedule. That is a very different kind of damage. Not the dramatic kind. not the kind that gets replayed on cable news, the kind that follows you into rent, school, work, and every ordinary decision that becomes harder when your home life still feels unsettled. And this is not happening in a place with endless financial cushion. Median household income in Mayfield is only around $41,000. Poverty is high. Home values are not sky high, but that almost makes the warning sharper, not softer. Because in a town where people were not sitting on huge reserves to begin with, a long housing shortage after a disaster does not just create inconvenience. It reshapes how people live. That is why the state announcing 122 new rental units for Mayfield matters so much. It is not just development news, it is proof that the housing hole left by that tornado was deep enough that years later it still needed a major response. And to be fair, Mayfield is not hopeless. The town is still moving, there is rebuilding, there is effort, there is resilience here, and that part is real. But that is exactly why this story hits harder. The most painful towns are not always the ones that gave up. Sometimes they are the ones still trying to stand, while everyday life remains built around an old wound. Mayfield feels like someone who left the hospital long ago, learned to walk again, learned to smile again, but at home still lives by the schedule of the injury. Kentucky is not a state without beauty, history, or good people. That is what makes this list harder and more important. The towns we talked about are not just bad places. They are warnings. Warnings about cheap housing that hides bigger costs, about quiet streets that can still carry deep strain, about strong local pride that does not always guarantee a strong future, and about communities that may look rebuilt on the surface while still carrying damage underneath. That is the real lesson here. Sometimes the hardest places to live are not the ones that look the worst right away. They are the ones that seem manageable until life starts collecting the hidden bill. If you live in Kentucky or have spent time in any of these towns, I want to hear from you. Which place do you think people misunderstand the most, and which town would you add to this list? Let me know in the comments, and if you want more countdowns like this, subscribe and stay with us.